I'm Glenn Davis, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome you to this final discussion to cap off ANZOG's Future Public Sector Leaders series. And the series has been a great success, and we're so pleased to have welcomed more than 900 registered participants from Australia and New Zealand, and in fact beyond, to these masterclasses, to the 3 presentations, and to today's capstone. Let me acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge the waterways, the beautiful lands of the traditional owners, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay regards to elders past and present, and to all First Peoples amongst us today. And of course, kia ora to our colleagues from Aotearoa in New Zealand. This is our capstone session, and it's a chance to look ahead, but not perhaps as you might expect to a sort of narrow discussion of the public service, but rather we want to think about the challenges of working with community and business around new models of policy development and service delivery. And so we're going to explore the topic from familiar and unfamiliar angles, and I'm delighted that we're going to do so in the company of some leading thinkers and practitioners. Today's webinar will be recorded. It will be uploaded to ANZOG's YouTube station. Who knew that ANZOG had a YouTube channel all to itself following the event? And there's, of course, a live Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and if you press it during the course of, toward the end of this, we'll get ourselves to some questions and give our panelists a chance to respond to those. But I'd like to start by introducing our distinguished panel, all of whom deserve a much longer bio statement than I'm going to give them. And I want to start with Professor Christy Muir, who is the CEO of the Centre for Social Impact and a Professor of Social Policy at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. She's had a long and distinguished career that spans more than 30 years, working with for-purpose organisations in Australia, first in the not-for-profit sector and now in academia. And alongside her impressive academic record, Christy sits on a large number of boards and committees which cover the intersections of government policy and community service delivery, including the New South Wales Premier's Council on Homelessness and the Gonski Institute for Education. So, Christy, welcome. It's a delight that you're here. Can I next welcome Sharon O'neill, who was appointed the Commissioner of the West Australian Public Service Commission in 2018, following 12 important years as the Director General of the West Australian Department of Education. She is the first woman to serve as the Commissioner in Western Australia. In 2020, with perfect timing, she was appointed to the WA State Recovery Control role. And that means she assumed responsibility for the development and the implementation of the $5 billion Western Australia COVID-19 recovery plan. And I'm sure we'll touch on that during the course of the afternoon. And this, of course, follows many contributions to the leadership in Western Australia and beyond. Sharon, it's a delight to welcome you. And our panel is completed by Rob Settler, who has been the Chief Executive of the Queensland Public Service Commission since 2017. But he comes to that role after a very long and distinguished career across the Queensland Public Service, including a number of Director General roles. He's also held various senior executive positions in the Queensland vocational education and training sector, and he currently serves as a Director of the Australian and New Zealand School of Government. Rob, welcome to you. And so to our discussion, if I may, I'd like to start with our 2 Public Service Commissioners, so to Sharon and Rob. Sharon, I'd like to start with an important trend that's now an old trend, but still very significant, and that's service integration. There are institutions in most states and territories, as in New Zealand, working to link existing services into a one-stop shop approach. This is always easier said than done, as technology, legal constraints and logistics all pose challenges. A recent Victorian Auditor General report, for example, just noted a disappointing failure to achieve the sort of savings expected from integrated service delivery. So can you tell us what's happening in Western Australia? What are the lessons and the challenges, and what works and what does not?
Well, thank you, and thanks for that introduction, and a big question to start with, Glenn. Thanks. So here in the West, on this service integration and the models that are being used, around the country, it's fair to say we've been lagging on that work. So as we got a bit more interested in this, even just in the last 18 months, before we kind of dive into that topic, we just had a little look at a couple of places around the state, and so you get the stories, and other states would be familiar with this, where within the radius of about 350 metres, there'd be 5 or 6 agencies, all running their own front office or service provision, their own IT, their own way of interacting with customers and delivering that service and interaction. And they did a bit of work, and we found 700 instances where people had 700 examples, individual examples, where people had to visit different sites within a very small area and interact differently with each one of those bodies. So here in the West, we decided to kick off with a trial site in Bunbury. For those of you that don't know Bunbury, it's probably the second biggest city, if you call it that. It is called a city, with a trial in beginning really around, or perhaps the middle of 2020. And so looking at what we call Service WA. So we're really at the start of that. But a couple of things come to mind already, then, in terms of the challenges around that. Perhaps 5 big ones, if I just touch quickly on those. Culture, agencies, and the way that they approach their services, I think, are quite rightly proud of the way they do their job. It's kind of entrenched their success, how they view their own services. And so, with culture, the second thing, probably control that comes from that. And it's bound up in the third, which is around structures, I think, just the way that we're appropriated, staffed, it's quite separate. And that, you can say they're reasons or excuses, in fact, but they do kind of contribute to this difficulty in getting started. I think also maturity with regard to the thinking and the systems thinking and that's required around this integration. And also, I think, kind of bound up in all of that, this is probably the last point I'll make, is this idea that we have been really driven around service delivery, which is kind of one-way modality. We're worried about how the service is delivered to people. And I don't think we've been as interested in how the service is experienced by people. And so that's a real change in mindset, I think. And many of us don't actually interact with many of the services that we're talking about on the ground. So, I think, those kind of 5 areas and wrapped up in a mindset shift that's been challenging, I think, here. So there's sort of some of the challenges. We've had a bit of early success. 15,000 people have interacted through that Service WA one site. 99% of them, think it's terrific that they don't have to front up over and over and over again and, show your ID and explain who you are and what you want for almost the same thing, renewal of a license. Just happens to be a fishing license or a driving license or some other license. So I would say early days for us, lots of learnings, some beginning success, but it's certainly something that the government's interested in. Underlying all of that is your digital capability, group buying, and all of the challenges that come with that, which we'll probably get to. But probably, Glenn, that's a bit of a snapshot.
Right. Sharon, thank you. And we're going to come back to a number of those themes because they're going to roll through, particularly the culture, the control, and the structures. And I guess the other impediment is still differences in levels of government. I recall talking to the head of Service New South Wales, who said the single most common inquiry in any of their outlets is, how do I get a Medicare form? Which is, of course, a Commonwealth form. And so they've just, their enterprising managers just go around to the nearest Commonwealth offices, pick up a whole set of forms and just dump them somewhere in the building to make them accessible. But it goes to that core problem. Rob Settler, thank you for joining us. Now, in Queensland, you've decided not to go down the integrated service one-stop shop route. Could you give us a bit of insight into what informed that decision and how are you thinking about service delivery?
Thanks, Glenn. Ditto to all Sharon has just said. I mean, really, she could very well have been describing the scenario here. And while it might appear, and indeed, in fact, I often say we're not going down the route of a single service-led model, in a sense, we've been on the journey of consolidating and aligning and standardising across agencies for many years. When I just go back, when I was in DPI, there was these attempts to integrate, particularly in regional areas, the service centres that had NRM, environment and science, primary industries, fisheries and others in one facility, because you could go in there and there'd be different counters with different staff. That was inefficient, but also changing that is an incredibly challenging cultural journey. So I think our approach really has been, while there's been some ambition to establish a Service Queensland type model, an ambition to standardise and one-stop shop, we've approached it more in terms of small gains, small wins, and while the imperative and the purpose and the mission is more clearly articulated. And we've tried a couple of times in the last couple of years, we, the government, to standardise that and agree on a model. As you might expect, moving from a distributed, empowered system, financed in the way as Sharon described, it's very difficult to cut across that and establish more horizontal approaches to integration of services. But so for me, same journey as at WA. We haven't launched into a big brand announcement, and we haven't taken an approach to say if we define it and we go public and we celebrate it and put a few bucks in it, then it'll happen. But rather steady as she goes and take opportunities to move more in that way. And the recent machinery of government change that we've done up here will help enable that to some extent. We have areas of excellence like our TMR or our customer service centres. They really do an outstanding job. And but the minute you then try to plug in others, it's the different IT systems. So just as Sharon has described. But I do think Sharon's final message is the right one. It's all very well to focus on delivery. It's actually the experience and how effective are we in designing and allowing the service models to reflect the way that the customer, whether that be the community level or individual level, wishes to secure that particular service. And I think this is the design element that requires a sophistication that I'm not sure we have in buckets just yet.
Thank you, Rob, for that. Can I ask you just to say a little more about the IT challenge? It's so fundamental, and I'm going to ask Sharon the same, but it's so, you're right, I mean, it's not just the organisational structures and budget incentives, but it's the incompatibility of systems. And most states have been through a 25-year journey to try and address that without necessarily landing.
Well, if I just go as an example, our payroll systems here, there's multiple payroll systems servicing agencies differentially. So when we try and capture HR data, we've actually got to talk to each of the different systems in order to pull a common narrative out of those data sets. It's easy to think, well, why don't you just have a single one? It's the transition from what you have to what you want and the capacity to invest over a long period of time to get that. And we've not been able to achieve that ambition, I guess, from government to say we're going to invest in this area. So we go on, do what we do, we take tiny steps where we can. But I would say that COVID has, particularly the savings and debt priorities that this government has asked of the public service, it will actually mean we'll probably ask the questions with greater earnestness and look to opportunities with more intent and purpose and not just accept, oh, it's just too hard.
Thank you. And Sharon, how's the West gone in integrating the system sufficiently to support a Service WA model?
Well, Glenn, look, I think it's probably fair enough, and I'm sure we are not orphans in this regard, similarly to what you were saying now, Rob. Whether it's integrated service or anything else, I think, you know, over time there'll need to be more investment in IT. It's really hard for governments to stay on top of that investment. It, you know, shifts and changes, and so you know, that's a challenge, but it's not a challenge peculiar to service integration. And sometimes I think, you know, in this idea of service integration, we can get a bit captured about it all has to be, you know, IT driven. Of course, that's really helpful, but it's not the only. I mean, it's a lever, it's a mechanism. But you know, for us, sharing of data, legislatively not necessarily enabled yet, although the government's, you know, looking at that. So. And I think this idea of service integration can get carried away on it all has to be digital. Of course, we would want that too. But there are some other basic things, that can be achieved by the mindset of integration, not that the default position is that it's IT, it's digital, the systems don't talk to each other, therefore we can't do it. And I think that's a trap because, in my view, governments and private industry will always struggle to stay in front of that huge, rolling ball of IT investment.
That's right. And the difference is that people now have the experience of interacting with their utilities and their bank, with very sophisticated systems, and expect the same from the public service, and are taken back when it's nothing like that same level. Let me mention that we have our very first question, which is great. We will come to the questions toward the end, but thank you to our anonymous attendee for beginning that process. I really do appreciate it. I'd like, though, to turn to the area that will be much of the focus this afternoon. It's what I've called collective impact. It's not a very helpful term, but collective impact projects have increasing prominence, and they also bring with them a whole set of challenges. The language changes, but the underlying assumption is this is about collaboration, about government not being in control, a phrase that Sharon used a minute ago, but actually having to work as a peer with community, with business, with not-for-profits. It's exemplified in a number of sort of high-profile projects. The Maranguka Justice Project in Western New South Wales, in Bourke, for example, is a lovely example of how a new approach calls into question standard models of service delivery around justice and provides a very powerful community-led alternative. So, Chrissy, this is your area of expertise, and it'd be just great to hear from you about this trend toward collaborative projects and how, as someone outside looking in, how you find government as a partner when it attempts to play this different role.
Thanks, Glenn. And let me just acknowledge that I'm sitting on Darrell speaking country in southern Sydney here, and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders of wherever you might be sitting, and acknowledge their traditional lands. I think the trend, you use the term collective impact, Glenn, and I think it's a really useful term because it's quite well known now, and it has become increasingly popular. But the example like the one we've seen in Bourke, it's actually not new. So we have seen examples of collaboration using different kinds of language for many, many decades. For some people from many, many years ago will remember when we used to talk about community development. That's an example from many decades ago. So the collective impact might be sort of new jargon, but it's actually what a collective impact actually is organisationally networked groups coming together for a shared purpose. And the shared purpose is not about them as organisations, but about the beneficiary that they seek to serve, or whatever individual group or family that might be at the centre. And it really does have that really long history. And in more recent times, some people on this call might have been engaged or involved with an example like Communities for Children, which was from the early 2000s, where we had a whole lot of early childhood organisations working together across sectors, which included governments. It was federally funded and included state and territory governments across all jurisdictions, and it included local governments, as well as a whole lot of not-for-profits and community organisations, that everybody was focused on how do we decrease early childhood vulnerability for 0 to 5-year-olds in low SES communities. And basically what happened was these groups rallied around this particular shared purpose, and resources were distributed and resources were included for things like collaboration, so that people could actually work together. And it was a really good example in some of the pieces that you've and my colleagues have referred to around shifting the power from government, because all of a sudden you've got a non-profit lead taking a whole lot of sort of not control, but really being more empowered around what does the community want, what does the community need, and how do we shift that. And let me just give you, there's many examples from this particular initiative, but one example that I really loved was in one particular community, they decided to fund one of the paediatric nurses to move into the local playground, because that's where the kids were. And, you know, we tend to talk about, and governments, service deliveries talk about hard to reach people, but actually maybe we're just hard to access. And so what they did was go to where the kids are, you know, low SES, they were hanging out. And what was happening was kids were getting to school with all sorts of issues that weren't necessarily being picked up, which then we all know puts them behind. And you start at 5 and you can pretty much predict what's going to happen to you throughout your education if you're starting from behind at scratch. And so these pediatric nurses went into these playgrounds, were picking up 2 and 3-year-olds and intervening early. So it's just a great example of shifting the thinking around how you might do this kind of work differently. I think the implications for the public service around these trends to collaborate is being prepared to work differently and understanding what role governments play in the system and where and when and how to coordinate versus when and how to collaborate and with who. And we can talk more about that in some more detail.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. Just going to that example, the early childhood example, you're looking for a way to integrate services that are around preschool education, health, possibly justice, kids in out-of-home care, and they tend to each be programs of different state departments. So what was the mechanism to bring those together around the playground or whatever the site is that integrates?
I think that there are various mechanisms, and we know under what conditions collaboration works best. And when we evaluated communities for children across different sites, as well as looking at what's happening in sites that have similar low SES status but weren't getting this kind of intervention, it obviously wasn't a panacea. It wasn't something where communities for children worked amazingly in every single location. And one of the things we could look at was what was happening within the sites where collaboration was working. And not just looking at that example, but looking at the history of collaboration over decades, we can actually pinpoint the things that matter most around what are the conditions that mean you're most likely to have success. Now, obviously, in terms of that example and some of the other examples, it's hard to work across sectors when you have different rules, etc. But there are sort of, I guess, 3 areas of conditions, and within that 4 kind of rules, if you like, of what we know works for good practice collaboration. So the 3 categories are, there are structural conditions that matter, there are process conditions, so the way that you work, and then there are relational things, like what are the traits of the people that we kind of need. From a structural perspective, the 4 things that really matter are that shared purpose and goal. So the shared purpose and goal has to be about the goal that you're trying to achieve collectively. And if it's about a single organisation, a single government department, or a single, jurisdiction, then you're in trouble. It's got to be the shared purpose. Secondly, there have to be shared resources. There has to be shared authority. So that's really the piece that we've already heard Sharon and Robert talk about around how do you shift some of those power pieces and what does that culture look like? And there has to be shared accountability. Those are the general structural rules, the 4 conditions. And then from a process perspective, how you work, things that you wouldn't be too unsurprised to hear, you want a good governing structure so that authorising environment can exist. You need to be adaptive and learning. So when you evaluate and you get data, you can adapt quickly and there's permission to change. You don't have to go back to signing new contracts or new MOUs, for example. Number 3, communication flows matter. Surprise, surprise. And number 4, you're really looking at that whole system engagement. It doesn't mean everyone's involved all of the time, but you're really clear about who matters when and how they might work together. And then just to wrap that last category up around the relational things that decades of research have told us matter, things that you would expect: trust matters, reciprocity matters, goodwill, and being committed to that, back to the beginning, that shared purpose.
Christy, thank you. That was just wonderfully clear and compelling. So can I turn to Sharon? You've just gone through a year of having to work with communities around COVID, and that's part compulsion and part persuasion and trying to make this work. Chris has just given us some of the challenges about getting community and government working together. They sounded remarkably similar to the challenges you outlined in getting government to work even together within government around service, shared service. So could you reflect for a minute on the experience of the recovery plan and how what you've learned about how government can work with communities through that.
Oh, and just thank Christy for that wonderfully articulate summary of all of that. I'm not sure I'll do justice to that, but from a practical perspective, so my role as State Recovery Controller for COVID was about putting together the WA State Recovery Plan. I think we're the first state to have such a thing. What it presented to me is this really interesting contrast of our normal policy making approach and the one that we were in. And in a nutshell, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it, most of us have had an experience of consultation about whether, and the question to myself always is, really is it consultation? Because I reckon we do a fair bit of selling our policy ideas rather than really consulting. We're often trying to win people over to the decision that really is largely made, except some, fabric changes around the edges, perhaps. So, I think my reflection on the difference between where I've been, perhaps, and where we ended up with recovery, it's something around that, because we had this moment where there was a collective enemy, to go to Christy's point around purpose. And I think this was a greatly solidifying part of how we responded here in the West around the recovery, because we were all kind of looking at this thing that we didn't really know the answer to, that, there's a fair bit of fear. So we kind of had this common goal, if you like. But the most important aspect or observation that I would make is, probably for the first time, and perhaps I shouldn't say this, but I guess I'm saying it to several hundred people, so there you are, is that us as public sector people, and we were given the role here with government, we needed other people in a way that sometimes I don't think our policy mindset, I don't think it takes us there. So no one had a script for COVID response and recovery. We kind of knew that it would have to involve, infrastructure and elements of it. So it was a much more genuine move towards people outside of the public sector to say, we've got this common goal, we need a hand, we need to be really innovative here. The time restrictions that it normally takes the public sector to do anything seem to kind of fall away. There was a huge authorising environment, to the points that Christy made, where the Premier, directly involved. Resources were, being thrown across boundaries. We had 30 ministerial roundtables in 12 days, just about killed us, where we had hundreds and hundreds of people. Most states did, I'm sure, in different ways. But it was the openness with which it was done. It was the genuine problem solving. We were really clear about non-negotiables, and so I just kind of talk about that in terms of it being a much more genuine approach to consultation or collective impact or working together, because we needed other people. Government is so large. I come from a very big department originally. We've got clever people. We know research, so we've kind of got options available. And as I said, I think that juxtaposition between tinkering a bit at the edges of some reasonably developed ideas versus a much more we need your help approach, and I think that's stood us in really good stead. We used our I Think platform. We actually also went out to the public and we said, here are these 5 big ideas in recovery around social recovery and economic recovery and regional. And we just actually blank paged it. Give us all of your ideas. We got thousands of ideas just from the public. So I just kind of go back to the fact it was sector blind, it was genuine, and everyone was respected in it. The Premier held himself, I organised it, but a full day with 50 people. The Premier was there all day. He's done it more than once. So the authorisation, the leadership, it wasn't kind of enacted through, another group of people. It's highly energetic. We came up with a good product. It'll, needs massaging because, times change and the economic situation in the state is in a different position, but it will stick in my mind. The lessons of that will stick in my mind about how people were engaged in a much more material, purposeful, valuable and enduring way. So perhaps, Glenn, that's a bit of a summary of how that went.
Thank you. That's a great summary. I'm going to ask Rob about a slightly different angle, though, on the same question about collaboration. So Rob's been involved in lots of complex conversations with Indigenous communities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across Queensland, and often these are about aspects of service delivery that have been difficult to deliver and raise questions about the role of government versus the role of community. Rob, can you reflect a little for us on your experience there and what you take out of that for the QPS's role?
Thanks, Glenn. I would clarify up front, I haven't personally been engaged in a whole raft of discussions. I've certainly been privy to and a part of those sorts of discussions. I think the important point is that the issue of leadership, and it goes to the points that Sharon was making. In Queensland, whenever we respond to a particular set of issues, particularly in disaster times, we stand up well because we are a disaster state. You know, cyclones, floods, bushfires, large distributed populations. It's required rapid responses, and then it became very entrenched and capable as a public service, not only leading, but in terms of reaching out and working with community, positioned us well to think about the question, so how do we take forward and develop policy settings similarly? And COVID certainly reinforced that. So we stepped into COVID as though it was just another natural disaster, similar frameworks, but ultimately it came down to leadership. We are, if you think about whether it's about the community sector or whether it's the not-for-profit or whether it's the for-profit sector, the challenge in terms of unification or having common purpose really is about the leaders in that sector, those respective sectors as singularly, but also collectively. So if we go to the public service, if we have 23 fiefdoms who are very independent in their own right because they've got resources and capability and believe they have a mission to deliver, then it becomes very difficult to shift that unless you influence the way that they've been resourced or have expectations of them. So for me, having your leaders willing and able to collaborate, appreciating they're not the end of service, they're part of service, is important. So recruiting into these leadership roles now, an imperative for us is that capacity to influence and influence change and be committed to a greater good than simply my own aid department. So there are various mechanisms to do that. When we go to the Indigenous, it's the same. The point of leadership in Indigenous communities, for example, is differential, and we need to appreciate how do we support the community to develop leadership capability and respect it in various forms within those communities. And I don't mean the word help, but sort of recognise there are different ways to do this. And that requires for us to think quite differently across the various communities. That SIP's repositioned itself under Chris Sara to lead a range of work around thriving communities. It's looking to an issue to pathway to treaty. It's actually considering voice at a state level, but also at a community level. And we'll plug into that the institutions of government to empower and enable that, but also to, most importantly, to learn from that. So I think the notion about working with community is absolutely critical in that sense, as it would be a natural disaster, be it of a COVID scale or even a cyclone. But at the heart of it is actually about commitment of leaders to a greater goal than simply their own, their own individual performance as a CEO. And I think that goes to the matter of ego. And we haven't discussed any of that element yet, but they're key, I think, in shifting systems and about enabling collaboration in ways that we aspire to, whether it be through collective impact examples or whether it be through simply day-to-day policy settings.
Thanks, Rob. And I do hope to get to the question of leadership. But before we do, I just would like to invite Christy just to follow through on, in particular, around Indigenous communities, because many people have argued that the failure of the Closing the Gap program is, as you pointed out, it's leadership, but it's also the failure to empower Indigenous communities, instead of which a preference for delivering services rather than empowering and standing back. And I'm just wondering, Christy, on your observations of collective impact projects, how good projects overcome that natural reticence? Because from government's point of view, this isn't an attractive proposition. You're handing over budget and authority to somebody else. There are very few announceables coming out of this, and in a sense, you're not putting yourself front and centre.
I think it's a really interesting, it's a really interesting question. I might just pick up on sort of where Robert finished, because I think it was a really nice and important point around the commitment of leaders to greater goals. And if it is about that, and he mentioned Chris Sarah's work, which is fantastic, by the way, in the Indigenous space, but also in working with communities and how you actually empower communities to actually, hold the work as opposed to governments sort of stewarding it. And we know, if you look at the history of all of the reviews that have been done into the non-profit sector, one of the issues has been around that government as constant steward, and what would happen if we started to shift the power. There's been sort of, everyone talks about the Productivity Commission review. We know the recent ones like review into aged care, etc. But there's been 93 reviews into the third sector and how government works to achieve social change with that third sector. That government as steward and always holding the power and holding on to the power is something that constantly comes up in this inquiry recommendation loop. So it's something we should listen to. On the very specific question of service delivery versus service experience, I really love that reference, Sharon. And I think the other thing to add to that is, what if it's not the service that's needed? And that then completely flips it, because you're going back to what happens when we go to the beneficiary or the person in the community, the kids, the families, the young people, and say, what is it that you need? And we understand it from your perspective. Let me give you 3 examples of government service provision over different evaluations of different program interventions at different state and or federal levels that I've seen, where something's been flipped as a result of a collaboration piece. So, constantly we have issues around kids going to early childhood centres, and, you've now got to be immunised to get in there. Well, one of the big challenges that, from the example in one of the Western Sydney collective impact projects around the Hive, that they found the parents didn't have the language or the skills to get birth certificates. And so that became the service intervention in that example. There was another program actually in Robert's jurisdiction some years ago, and they put a heap of money into getting parents to try and, the idea was, if only parents were aspirational and cared about their education of their kids, we'd be okay. And I'm sitting down having a cup of tea with this mum whose kid should be in care. And I talked to her about this new care centre that's free of charge, the government's open, what's going on? And she's like, well, actually, there's a 6-lane highway. I can't cross it. And I would love nothing more than be able to access it, but I need transport, So, and the third example was actually a Tasmanian intervention where governments at various levels for many years had spent millions of dollars on this particular family around all sorts of different interventions. And the collective impact response of this different collaborative project that came along basically realised that a lot of this was to do with mum needed dental care. And what happens if you fix mum's teeth? And so it's really interesting when you flip this to say, what if it's not the service that's needed? What is it that we actually need to do to ensure that we can get to that shared purpose, that commitment from leaders for greater goals that Robert talked about? So I think that, like some of those things around how do you do that and how do you know when to collaborate is really important, because it doesn't have to be all the time. And I think, both Sharon and Robert, I'm conflating your names, apologies. Both Sharon and Robert have referred to systems thinking. And I think the key is not everyone has to work at a systems level, but everyone needs to know how to understand the system, where they play, what their role is, when you should and shouldn't collaborate, and who with. So when do you work alone? When do you work together? And then when do you take it to the next step and set up some kind of collaboration? I'll just finish on one other sort of piece. I do a lot of teaching in governing for social impact, which includes governments. I've trained police commissioners and various government departments at multiple levels, and then a whole lot of board directors, for-purpose board directors. And one of the things we do is, how do you apply systems thinking? And we do this in a very practical sense, but one of the pieces is sort of putting together a matrix after we do a systems thinking example of who has the most ability to influence change out of all the agents, including government departments at all levels, versus who cares enough to actually do something about it. And the frightening thing is, you'll be surprised how often in that top right-hand corner of who cares the most and who has the most influence, nothing's happening. And all the activity and the busyness and the connections are happening in the spaces where we're not necessarily going to see the change we want to shift to.
Thank you, Christy, for that really helpful, and it nicely exemplifies Sharon's earlier point about we worry about service delivery rather than the experience of receiving service and whether it's the appropriate service. Now, we are going to go to Q&A in a second, and I remind you there's an opportunity to use the Q&A button to add your question. Thank you for the many people who already have. Look forward to get to them. But before we do, I want to go to Rob's challenge, and that is, if we're going to design policy and deliver programs in a different way toward a more collaborative model, then potentially we're going to need different sort of leaders, or at least different sort of leadership. And I'm just really keen to hear from each of our three panelists about what they're looking for in contemporary leadership, public sector leadership that can deliver these sorts of programs. So, Rob, you're very much an advocate of providing opportunities for leaders to emerge rather than, for example, hothousing them in academies or leadership programs. Can you say a little about what you're looking for as you try to think about the next generation of leadership for the Queensland Public Service?
I think I would encase it in my experience coming back into government when we had leadership of a style that was highly focused on downsizing the service, and the method used to achieve policy objectives was very brutal, was not collaborative. It was actually about hitting targets, so that public servants were, in a sense, were a number, and that getting those numbers down mattered more than the people who were delivering the service as public servants. It would be my summary of the situation. Since that time, with the change of government and the change of direction, we've been rebuilding a service. But in rebuilding that, it's not just about more public servants, it's actually about building a culture of collaboration and appreciation. We are a human system, and that will optimise the return from every part of that system if we recognise and empower at all levels possible. So that it's not actually about the building I'm in, 1 William Street, as being the headquarters for the public service, and all decisions are in fact out of here and all the wisdom sits on level whatever. It is actually about how we can empower regional and distributed leadership so that people get about their business and understand how best to shape and deliver community the services that are required. You don't do that in a highly autocratic and structured way. You actually have to build connections, you've got to actually build trust, and most of all, build confidence, not only through the system, but back up the system. There's got to be confidence in the public servants who work in those communities that they can get on, they have authority to be different. And I have to tell you, it's been a real challenge in where we have existing ways of funding departments and ways of expecting performance indicators that are more old school than new, to get people to have confidence to have a go. Because there's actually, it takes a belief in self-confidence that I think needs to grow over time. I would also point out that the further you get away from Brisbane, having been a regional public servant, the less there is a view that it really matters what happens in Brisbane, we should just get on and do anyway. And so it's encouraging that, I guess, that pioneer spirit, that sense of let's do it, and have a sense of confidence to do it, and limit whatever limited resources we can direct from the centre to support it is actually the sort of leadership that we actually need. You don't have to be promoted in order to, sorry, you don't have to go to Brisbane in order to be promoted. We need to be able to have distributed leadership, distributed opportunities. We need to be able to empower and enable at a community level, and we've got to build trust and confidence. That requires at a system level different leaders. It's not about ego, it's not about mine's bigger than yours. It's actually about we have a purpose here. It's not my money, it's the state's money. It's about making a better Queensland, and that requires a very great shift, in my view, which the journey we've been on up here, into having leadership at all levels and have people believing that they can do it.
Thank you, Rob. That's great. And Sharon, I'm going to ask you pretty much the same question. When you think about who you need to be recruiting, training, who you need to promote, and what the leadership of the West Australian Public Service is going to look like, what are you looking for?
If I'm thinking at the sort of highest level and sort of challenges that we have in front of us, the cadence of how our work is, you know, there's no policy purity. We don't have time for it. The focus on production of what I call the production, you know, products and processes rather than big ideas. So that kind of generation of products and processes. and the fast spinning wheel that a lot of us are on. What I'm looking for, Glenn, probably in a nutshell, is what I would call learning agility. So we can produce charts of skills and competencies. By the time you're in a really senior position, for me, that's just the starting point, not the end point. So yes, of course, we want you to have strategic thinking and analysis and great interpersonal skills and all that kind of stuff. But what I'm really looking for is that learning agility, to be able to turn your mind quickly, to be able to see opportunities, to understand the areas that are the highest leverage areas. Do you understand the levers that are around you? Do you have good radar? Can you adapt that thinking to the different scenarios rather than this kind of fixed approach, because I've been taught about this is how policy making is, it's linear. Well, it ain't, in this world. So I guess that's what I'm after first. And with that, and probably allied with that, for me, and most of it's about mindset. That's what I'm really interested in. So high level base skills are just a given for me. Then it's learning agility. It's the mindset that you bring to it, the level of introspection, the kind of spirit of service that Rob was talking about there. I mean, when you look at psychology, you can't empower people. It's an internal locus of control. People feel empowered or not. What we have to do is set the conditions for people to feel empowered. So, a lot of that for me is around mindset. I think you need a good balance of compassion and mongrel all at once. And what I mean about that is being able to make the hard and compassionate decisions, because the jobs require all of that. Rob, system thinking, understanding the total ecosystem. So we're not after much here, we're after the perfect person. But in a lot of ways, we're not. We're after people, who can adapt their thinking to situations, who have that great intelligence, I think, around those things. And I wouldn't mind if they have a good sense of humour too, because by God, they'll need it.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Christy, looking into the public sector, what do you value in a really great public sector leader?
Look, I'll keep this pretty succinct, but I do think that, what would it look like if we all came to it with not thinking we don't have the answer? I think that actually a lot of leadership traps are around everybody fronting up. And we're used to being in these roles because we're good at it. Technically we might be brilliant at something, but actually in these kind of complex problems, we can't fix them alone as individuals, and we can't fix them alone within organizations, because that's the nature of complex problems. And when we look at one of my favorite leadership books is Berger and Johnson's, the habits for effective leadership in complex times. And the three things they recommend is: ask different questions, 2, see different perspectives, and 3, see systems. And I think those are really beautiful habits of leadership that tap nicely into some of the things that Sharon and Robert have already given us. And then the final thing beyond those 3 habits that I would say is find the pause. Find the pause to be in that space of not necessarily knowing. Find the pause to ask those different questions. Find the pause to say, what other perspective are we missing here? Find the pause to say what else is going in the system and which are the levers that we should be pulling rather than the ones that we might be now.
Great, thank you. It was marvellous. A summary of a book in one paragraph. That was excellent. So we have a series of really great questions. We won't get to them all, but I'm going to try and combine a couple of them. And let me start one with each to Sharon and Rob, and they're about bright spots. So we've talked about what good looks like. We've touched on it in various ways. Can you think, each of you, from a single example from your jurisdiction of something that impresses you as a way of sort of new forms of leadership playing out to the benefit of community in a more collaborative way? Sharon, would you like to start?
So, Glenn, you're asking about good examples or different ways of thinking around leadership, perhaps?
Mm.
Yeah, look, I think what we've seen in the West here is an emergence, a bit as Christy and Rob were talking about, is this losing the mantle of the leader sitting atop of the pile of this big organisation. So something about sort of authenticity, vulnerability, making connection on the ground. And so when Christy was talking a little earlier about the integration, it sort of struck me, one of our Director Generals here, sadly in the fire recently, lost her home. And she tells the story, so this goes to authenticity, she tells the story to us other senior leaders of having to show her identity or prove her identity on 7 different occasions with no documents. She's a well-known senior leader in the public sector, and so for her, the experience of her own service, of her own department, and what that kind of breathed into how she was leading, that kind of authenticity. I was really impressed with that, and how she was able to come back into the public sector, because many of us in the public sector, particularly middle class or whatever background, we don't get to be on the end of a lot of our services. And so there's this bit of a breath at the moment of some of our Director Generals actually experiencing on the other end, to take us back to that service integration question, actually trying to get up there and experience the service that they provide. And I see some good things, but by God, they see some things that worry them greatly. And to all those examples you gave about being able to cross the road or something similar. So I kind of like that leadership that I'm seeing in a couple of places here, that's about getting out on the ground. Another Director General, wore one of those bracelets on your ankle for being traced, just to understand the judgment that comes with that in the community from other people and parents, and so I really like the feel of that. It feels to me genuine, and putting yourself in this, I guess, a vulnerability to understand that service you're providing. So there's one example, Glenn.
That's great, thank you. And Rob, can you think of an example from Queensland, and possibly one that doesn't involve burning someone's house down, just so they can empathise with the customer?
I'll try my hardest. I think the most recent really has to be testament to our public servants' commitment to make a difference. And this comes through the COVID example. Mm-hmm. We're mobilising public servants in large numbers around priorities around COVID. In a traditional setting where people were aligned to particular outputs in particular agencies with their own line management, getting them to think about, I will from tomorrow go and do this task over here to make a contribution to the COVID response, and not worry about my day job back home, because I know it will be covered off by the team that is there, having the manager agree that they will go and cover all the usual leave and other matters that go with that, has been quite refreshing to see that willingness to do that. When did we have our last response? This last round of case we've got with the lockdown started, say, a week and a half ago. So within an hour of a call out to public servants to who we had been readied in pools to take up the contact tracing, we had filled the roster going through April, simply by one call out. So that's a signal to me that the system, if it's clear about the purpose, the individuals in the system and the system's networks will respond accordingly. And I think that's the sort of culture that enables innovation. That's the culture that rewards people who are prepared to take a chance. But ultimately, it builds on this "why are we public servants" thing, which is at the heart, I think, of good public service. We're here to make a difference and we want to do it. So just help us understand how.
Can I just add to Rob,
sure,
what he just said? I mean, COVID has brought out the magnificence of the public sector in all states. I just really want to back in Rob's comments there. It's been fantastic.
Yeah. I agree entirely, and a number of people have raised the question, which is the one I was about to throw to Christy, about the lessons from COVID and whether we can find ways to apply those going forward. Not just, I guess, the policy solutions, but the way we've worked and that sort of commitment that Rob just so vividly described. Christy, what do you draw from the COVID experience? And I say that as someone talking to someone who's just had to be locked in an apartment for 3 days because you've made the mistake of going to Queensland.
Yeah, that was a mistake. Shouldn't visit Rob's hometown. It's a mistake. And then go to Melbourne. No, I'm just teasing. I think there's lots we can learn from COVID. And interestingly, something that Sharon said at the very start was one of the things that COVID has done is galvanize that shared purpose. And, and I think we've seen that with some of the natural disasters also that Rob's spoken to. So it's not just COVID, but, we started the end of 2019, we had floods, then we had bushfires, and then we have COVID, and now we're back to floods again. And what we've seen with these cycles is the galvanizing around what actually happens when communities start to work together. What happens when we start to live for the collective good? I think we've seen people, whether they notice it or not, use that kind of collective good ethical framework around making decisions about what they do and don't do, and when they how they work and for what purpose. We have seen, like we haven't seen before, some great examples of coordination and collaboration by government departments and non-profits and others around how do you actually get together for the purpose for which we need. I think on the other bit, so I think there's lots to be learned, and then of course that's sort of all the positives of it, and there are things that haven't quite gone right that we can also learn from and think about how we work going forward. And I think one of the interesting ones is sort of the reflection that people have had around busy work versus work that we actually need to do. And there's this great cartoon of caveman pulling along a cart with square wheels, and somebody's got the round wheel and they're like, we're too busy. And I think that image for me is so classic around, doesn't matter which sector we're in, but so often we're so busy doing the work we do that we don't think differently about how we should do it. And I just want to land on the lived experience / beneficiary piece. I really love that. How do we walk in the shoes and how do we be really empathetic? But the piece that's really important, and there's lots of good examples we don't have time to go into, but actually, how do we do downward accountability? How do we bring the voices of lived experience in a really authentic way so that they're listened to? And how do we adapt our cultures so that actually they fit in? We're not expecting them to fit in with us. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space. And some of the things that we've learned through COVID and the bushfire crisis have helped to heighten that, as well as, obviously the Black Lives Matter piece that's been at the fore as well.
Christy, thank you. We only have a minute left, but there's a great question that's been raised from one of our participants, and it deserves just a minute. It goes to what seems to be a technical problem, but it's actually really profound. Lots of collective impact, collaborative projects fail because of machinery of government changes. Suddenly you've got a different public servant, a different minister, a different department. That isn't necessarily a change of government, it can just be a restructure. But all of the relationships that you've built up fall over, and suddenly you're talking to new people, they don't understand the program, you're not their priority. And by the time they slowly come to grips with it, it's collapsed. It's a really standard pattern, unfortunately. I'm just wondering, and it's a really tricky question, what can we do to provide stability at that delivery level that stops the endless churn of structure? Sharon, easy problem.
Easy problem. Well, a lot of other things prevail during machinery of government changes. So I think there's something to learn from that. Often collective impact initiatives are short-term funded, people are deployed to them in a less, permanent, ongoing way. And I think while it remains a bolt-on, kind of nice to have, great thing to do, but is not core business, then it will always suffer the fluctuations. Our position on, our department's finances or industrial relations, those things don't flop about in the wind with machinery of government because they're front and centre. So it might be something about that. I offer, that as an idea, and I guess while it's an optional extra and not part of the fabric of how we work, it'll always be subject to the ebb and flow.
Thank you. Rob, how can we provide some stability?
Well, this is the ever-present challenge, I think, and it goes to for the most senior leaders in government. We sit at the interface between politics and bureaucracy. And it's a dangerous and quirky and mysterious place to be. Machinery of government is, of course, a government of the day decision about changes following its election. And in doing that, it's the mystery of what underpins those decisions that's important. And I think what I've come to learn over the years, when you live in part of a system and you drive it, I've made the mistake of thinking others who are receiving it or are really sitting alongside of it, understand the implications of stopping and starting. And I think our harsh reality is that's not well understood on the politics side of changing some of these structures and ways that cause these impacts that you say. And so do I have a remedy? I think it's how we, in the time going forward, get a greater blend of understanding of this interface and how it works better, and an exchange of ideas prior to decisions that is a contributing factor to decisions will be important, but it's a murky and clouded space.